Over the years, DC Comics has managed to destroy its competition when it comes to fantastic superhero genre video games. Batman Arkhamverse, along with the Injustice franchise and even DC Universe Online, have really proven to give gamers not only a great playing experience, but intriguing stories, solid game mechanics, and perhaps, most importantly, it's kept them entertained, which is much more than what we can say about the titles on our list today. The top 10 worst DC video games. While DC has a history of a lot of lackluster video game titles, we've tried to compile the worst of the worst, and made sure not to focus too much on a few particular heroes who have had some unfortunate game adaptations. Superman. So with that in mind, let's get to it. At number 10, Justice League Task Force for the SNES and the Genesis, 1995. From 1995, Justice League Task Force was one of the comic giants' first attempts at a fighting game featuring their iconic characters. With a limited roster of fighters to play as and controls that were constantly unresponsive, this title has nothing on the Injustice series. Characters' movesets were lackluster. The combat was repetitive, and overall, many players felt it was just a boring title. At least we know that DC has learned its lesson now, going with NetherRealm Studios to produce a much more superior fighting series for their properties. But also, Superman has a mullet in it, so you win some, you lose some. Mullet Superman. And at number 6, Swamp Thing for the NES and the Game Boy from 1992. Poor Swamp Thing. This hulking green fellow has always had a bit of a difficult time with spin-off media outside of his comic, including this 1992 title released for the NES and Game Boy. Graphically, it's fairly decent, but where it really struggles is with its difficulty and with the character's pace. Could he shuffle along any slower? The difficulty varies throughout as well, often becoming borderline gimmicky, making it a game that is less about skill and more about luck. Plus, without a password system, if you die, you're basically screwed, and that's no fun now, is it? And at number 8, The Death and Return of Superman for the SNES and the Genesis from 1994. The Death and the Return of Superman is by no means a good game. It's got a lot of flaws, but perhaps the worst part about it is the fact that it's based on one of the most ridiculous plotlines to ever exist in DC Comics. Specifically, the one that ruined death in comics on an industry-wide scale. Yes, the death of Superman. Now, if you're subscribed to our sister channel Top 10 Nerd, you'll probably know I have a pickle with this particular story arc and how flat-out stupid and self-serving it is. Long story short, Superman was killed by Doomsday. Everyone thought he was dead. A bunch of Superman imposters come out of the fray, they all suck. And then, surprise, Superman was brought back. He only appeared to be dead because he was in a Kryptonian coma. Yeah. DC made a ton of money, fans were hella pissed and felt betrayed, and ever since that story's release, Resurrection Comics has exponentially increased. Thanks to DC collaborating with Blizzard Entertainment, we got this wonderful little gem, a Superman game that lets you play as all the imposter Supermen, and you go around beating up thugs and other Supermen in this beat-em-up side-scroller. It was highly repetitive, and critics panned its soundtrack, and Blizzard got a lot of heat for not giving players something on par with the rest of their titles in terms of quality. And at number 7, Batman Forever for the SNES, Genesis, PC, and Game Boy. If you thought Superman's side-scroller was bad, enter Batman Forever, a tie-in video game of sorts that was released in 1995. While the title did get some praise concerning its graphics across platforms, its controls were abysmal. Electronic Gaming Monthly put it perfectly. I quote, "Punching enemies is nothing more than a delayed sequence that continues well after the enemy is dead." GamePro noted that, I quote, "The sluggish gameplay, mediocre graphics, and weak sounds really kick this cart to the back curb." While Batman, Robin, and their foes' sprites were well crafted, the backgrounds in the game were pretty bland, washed out, and only further contributed to the game being cited as boring by many critics and players alike. Moving on to number 6, Superman Returns for the PS2, Xbox 360, and the Nintendo DS from 2006. On paper, the 2006 Superman Returns game sounds like a pretty awesome title. It's a tie-in video game for the Brandon Roth starring Superman Returns film, but it actually toyed with a really interesting gameplay mechanic. Basically, Metropolis has a health bar, and you, playing as Superman, must keep the city safe, take out threats, survive yourself, and also prevent all things chaotic. But in reality, the game suffered from some really poor mechanics and design choices, which made the gameplay pretty stale. And the best part? Well, the main final villain of the game was not Lex Luthor, and it wasn't any of Superman's other famous foes from his rogue gallery either. It was a tornado. The final boss is a damn tornado. As the AV Club so eloquently put it, I quote, "A making-of documentary on how such a precious franchise was so flagrantly mishandled would be far far more entertaining than anything the game has to offer. Gotta say, I'd actually be pretty on board for that. Watch it. And at number 5, Watchmen: The End Is Nigh for the PS3, PC, and Xbox 360. The End Is Nigh is a prequel of sorts, but therein lies the problem. Watchmen is a story that is so rich and complex that having a video game that is meant to further enrich the story, dabble into territory that is less compelling than what actually happens in the actual Watchmen narrative, feels like a really poor decision. A tie-in to the 2009 film directed by Zack Snyder, and perhaps one of his only good DC films, unpopular decision I know. This game lets you play as Rorschach or Night Owl through the course of 6 chapters during 1972 and the character's crime buster days, prior to the passing of the Keene Act in 1977. Despite this, the game's narrative felt quite shallow, focusing on beating up foes without much strategy to boot. It offered couch co-op, despite a major desire for online co-op, and while it was called a decent beat-em-up title by critics, ultimately it was panned for its repetitive action, level design, and lack of difficulty. And at number 4, Batman: Dark Tomorrow for the Xbox and the GameCube from 2003. There was a relatively decent amount of hype for this Batman title. It was a pre-Arkhamverse video game and people were pretty stoked. The people behind it were also well known and liked. DC Comics veteran and Batman Gotham Adventures writer Scott Peterson, along with Final Fantasy's Kenji Terada, were responsible for the game's story. The Royal Philharmonic Orchestra performed the game's score too, which is pretty neat. The title was in development for 4 years, and after it was presented at E3 2001, fans were really excited. But when the game actually came out, it was rotten with glitches and bugs, many of which broke the game altogether. And the Dark Knight's combat mechanics were frustrating at best, and the camera movement made playing the title more of a struggle than an enjoyable experience. Perhaps the most hilarious and painstaking aspect of this title is that after you defeat enemies, you need to handcuff them, resulting in players seeing the same animations over and over and over again, which, as you can imagine, was a buzzkill as far as pacing was concerned. On the flip side of that, it did receive some praise from critics concerning its story and its cutscenes, but hey, one piece of a whole does not make for a good game, unfortunately. It just makes for a disappointing one. Moving on to number 3, Catwoman for the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, and Game Boy Advance, and also PC from 2004. It should be no surprise that one of the worst ever DC adaptations produced one of the worst ever video game tie-ins. Here we have a game that has zero understanding of the character, at least when it came to combat. Catwoman's fighting style in the comics was like barely incorporated. She kinda just used her whip like a dollar store Indiana Jones, and then her moves were significantly overpowered, making levels a walk in the park. The kinds of movements you could also do were restricted too, and failed to have any sense of flow, making it more frustrating to play than anything else. Also, Sharon Stone looks like a literal nightmare in her digital recreation. Ugh. Luckily, we finally got a version of Selina Kyle that did the character justice in the Arkhamverse, with her appearance as a playable supporting character in Batman Arkham City. But this game, it's no bueno. And at number 2, Aquaman: Battle for Atlantis for the GameCube and the Xbox from 2003. Aquaman: Battle for Atlantis is a digital train wreck. Where do we even begin? The camera movement as you navigate the underwater city of Atlantis is terrible. Comic book panels are used to bridge together the narrative and cutscenes, which theoretically could have been a neat choice if it wasn't for the fact that the developers attempted to create a mashup of images and in-game engine graphics, in which sometimes the text and speech bubbles didn't even fit properly in place. The combat mechanics are absolute garbage. All 21 levels are ridiculously repetitive, and the graphics, oh dear god, the graphics, they're awful, but I just can't look away. Don't even get us started on how lackluster Atlantis turned out. Overall, Battle for Atlantis not only was a huge disappointment, but it also managed to soil Aquaman's already questionable reputation even more. Poor fella. He deserves better. And finally, in at number 1, Superman 64 for the Nintendo 64. Released in 1999, Superman 64 is almost absurd in nature. For starters, the story doesn't even take place in Metropolis. Instead, you're dumped into a virtual reality. Fun. In which you have to complete tasks like flying through rings as a timer counts down. Whoa, exciting! You're thrown into random missions that lack exposition to make them interesting. The graphics felt super unpolished, to the point where many critics debated whether or not the game had even been properly finished prior to its release, and that was actually a semi-accurate guess. According to the lore, the development of the game was hindered by DC and Warner Bros., to the point where by the time it was set to be released, the game was unfinished and lacked quality. Another developer attempted to redo the game for the PlayStation, but the initial developer Titus Interactive's license expired prior to completion, and Warner Bros. Ultimately just cancelled it. In addition to that, its worst sin of all is perhaps the most painful one. It's boring, really boring to play. It should be no surprise that it's become known as one of the worst video games of all time. Alright, there we have it, friends. What other DC video games do you guys think just absolutely suck? Give us a shout in those comments below and let us know why. If you dug this video, spread the love, hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe to Top 10 Gaming for more lists just like this one. We also have done a little list on the worst Marvel games, so, you know, if you're curious, head on over to our channel and give it a look. In the meantime though, thanks for watching friends, I'll catch you all in the next video.